So now that we've made our unit circles, all of those values on there can be used to do a bunch of mental math. So we're going to want to figure out, like, what is sine of 7 pi over 6 equal to? Well, if we wanted to figure out what 7 pi over 6 is equal to, sine of 7 pi over 6, the process is going to work as follows. First of all, you're going to recognize right away that this is part of the pi over 6 family. So that's the nice thing about radians. It's really easy to figure out that the reference angle for this is pi over 6 because it's part of the pi over 6 family. You're going to think 7 pi over 6, what quadrant is 7 pi over 6 in? It's in quadrant 3. And once you know that it's in quadrant 3 and you know that the reference angle is pi over 6, you can think, well, I know that sine of pi over 6 is 1/2, so sine of 7 pi over 6 will also be 1/2, but because it's in quadrant 3, it'll be negative. And so I'm going to get negative 1/2. So you're going to recognize your family, basically your first quadrant on your unit circle. You have that memorized, or you're in the process of having it memorized. And you would know that sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Since 7 pi over 6 is in quadrant 3, and according to your cast rule, in quadrant 3 sine is negative, you know that sine of 7 pi over 6 is negative 1/2. So we recognize that this is part of the pi over 6 family. You think of your unit circle, and here's pi over 6, and sine is the y-coordinate. So you know that sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Then 7 pi over 6 is in quadrant 3. In quadrant 3, sine is negative. So sine of 7 pi over 6 will be negative 1/2. So we think about what quadrant it's in to find out whether it's positive or negative. We think of the family to figure out its value. So for the second one here, tan of 2 pi over 3. Okay, we know that that's in quadrant 2. Is tan positive or negative in quadrant 2? It's negative. And tan of pi over 3 is root 3. So tan of 2 pi over 3 will be negative root 3. So we got to do a lot of mental math in this one, and that's why you're preparing on Friday for your quiz, for studying for that, so that when you see these values, you can do them quickly. 7 pi over 4, what quadrant is that in? Quadrant 4. Cos of 7 pi over 4 then, well, cos of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. And since we're in quadrant 4, where cos is positive, it will stay positive root 2 over 2. Secant of negative pi over 4. Well, when you get to your reciprocal ones, again, first you're going to think about the ones that you know. So I'm going to do cos of negative pi over 4. Notice that the angle never flips. The answer, or the ratio, will be the reciprocal, but you never change the angle. So I'm going to figure out what cos of negative pi over 4 is. First of all, can you see that that is in quadrant 4, where cos is positive? And we already know that cos of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So cos of negative pi over 4 will also be root 2 over 2 and positive. Once you figure out what cos is, you can now figure out secant will be the reciprocal of the answer. 2 over root 2, which if you rationalize is equal to root 2. You might remember that root 2 over 2 was 1 over root 2 before we rationalized it. Cotangent, negative 11 pi over 6. Yes. Go back to this one. If I rationalize this, I will get 2 root 2 over 2, and then these would simplify, and you would get root 2. But you can also see it a lot easier. If you hadn't rationalized 1 over root 2, and you flip that one, then you'll get root 2 right away. Cotangent, negative 11 pi over 6. So with negative angles, one thing that I do is I sort of think, do I have 11 pi over 6 on my pi plate? Yes, it's in quadrant 4. So now if I'm thinking about a negative 11 pi over 6, I have to think about going in the negative direction 4 quadrants. That would make you end in quadrant number 1. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Is that normally, like, as a positive angle, 11 pi over 6 is in the 4th quadrant. So if you're thinking about the negative angle 11 pi over 6, you have to think 1, 2, 3, 4 going to the 4th negative quadrant. Well, the 4th negative quadrant is the first positive quadrant. So that can help you figure out that this angle has to be in quadrant 1. Yes? Because there's a negative sign. Yeah, negative sign's always clockwise. So a standard angle, if it's negative, means that it goes clockwise. Standard angle, if it's positive, goes counterclockwise. And so now that we know that it's in quadrant 1, you go to your unit circle. What is pi over 6 for tan? You can take out your papers if you want. Close. No. Root 3 over 3. Part of the way that I remember the tan of the pi over 6 has a 6 on the bottom, and 3 plus 3 is 6. And tan of pi over 3 is root 3, and 3 is equal to 3. Little things to help you study, to help you memorize things. So, tan of a negative 11 pi over 6 will be root 3 over 3. That means that cotangent of negative 11 pi over 6 is the reciprocal. And if you remember that this one originally was 1 over root 3 before we rationalized it, you could also write cotangent of negative 11 pi over 6 as root 3 over 3. Yeah, I can go back. And our last one, cosecant of negative pi over 2. So we've got cosecant. So we're going to think about sine of negative pi over 2. And this is part of which family? Our axes family. So if we're thinking about our unit circle and negative pi over 2 being that point right there, it's not really in quadrant 3 or quadrant, it's like in between quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So what I do with anything that happens to be on the axes family, it's really easiest just to think of the coordinates. What are the coordinates right here? 0, negative 1. So what is sine, the x coordinate or the y coordinate? The y coordinate. So sine of negative pi over 2 is equal to negative 1. Didn't really have to think about the cast rule, I just took the coordinate. So then cosecant like, could you go directly from here to negative 1? This one wouldn't be too bad to go there. But some of them you would like to show a little bit of work just because a little bit of work is needed. Yes? Negative pi over 2 is negative 90 degrees. It would go that direction. And on that angle, these are our coordinates. Now, typically on an exam, these questions don't come up just as a single, figure out one of them. They put all three of them, put many of them together and get you to add, subtract, multiply, divide. So this question, and I'm going to do it in 3 different colors, we're going to figure out what secant of 11 pi over 3 is. Yes? No, there'll always be numbers that you've memorized or numbers that are coterminal. And that's why we did assignment 1 on that sheet. Like, no, it won't be over 7. They'll be over 3, will be over 4. They'll be your axes family. If they're anything other than that, you'd need your calculator, and then it would be on a calculator part. But this would be a non-calculator question. So we're going to figure out secant of 11 pi over 3. I'm going to do that one in blue. I'm going to figure out cos of negative 5 pi over 4. I'm going to put green brackets there. And then tan of 23 pi over 6. I'm going to do blue black brackets there. And we're going to figure out each of these separately. So in blue, I'm going to start off to the side showing some work. I'm going to start by figuring out secant of 11 pi over 3. Well, to do that, we're going to first figure out what cos of 11 pi over 3 is. A little bit of a reminder from yesterday. How do you figure out what quadrant 11 pi over 3 is in? Do you remember what we did? We change this. 11 pi over 3 is the same as 3 2/3 pi. Change the 11 over 3 to a mixed fraction. If we change it to a mixed fraction, what this means is that you are going to go 3 pi, 1 pi, 2 pi's all the way around. Any odd number is going to end here. And if you go another 2/3, that's more than half. This is going to end in quadrant 4. So by figuring out that it ends in quadrant 4, we now know that cos of 11 pi over 3 is going to be positive. And from your unit circle, what's cos of pi over 3? Again, you might want to take your papers out for right now so you can reference it. 1 over 2. So if cos of 11 pi over 3 is 1 over 2, secant of 11 pi over 3 will be 2 over 1. And we can fill in the first set of brackets. So it's a fair bit of thinking just to figure out that first one. That secant of 11 pi over 3 is equal to 2. Now we've got to do the second one, so we'll go to green. Cos of negative 5 pi over 4. What quadrant would that be in? Quadrant 2. Again, if you find 5 pi over 4 on your unit circle, it's in quadrant 3, but that's going in the positive direction. Now we're going negative 5 pi over 4, so you'd have to go 3 quadrants in the negative direction, which would end in quadrant 2. So is cos positive or negative in quadrant 2? It's negative. So our answer is going to be negative. And cos of pi over 4, root 2 over 2. So now I know that this will be negative root 2 over 2. And finally, tan of 23 pi over 6. How would I write 23 pi over 6 as a mixed fraction? Three and 5/6. So what quadrant does it end in? Quadrant 4. If it ends in quadrant 4, tan is negative in quadrant 4. And what is tan of the pi over 6 family? Tan is negative in quadrant 4. And what's tan of the pi over 6 family? Square root 3 over 3. Yes? So 23 pi over 6, and this is what you did yesterday and hopefully got finished last night with your homework, was with all of the pi over 6 ones, 23 pi over 6 is coterminal with 11 pi over 6. Its reference angle is pi over 6. And the nice thing about radians is that if you see an angle like this and it doesn't reduce and it's pi over 6, that's its reference angle. If you see an angle that has pi over 4, its reference angle is going to be pi over 4. And so all you need to know as far as your values are is what they are in quadrant 1. So I know that tan of pi over 6 is root 3 over 3. And so I know that tan of 23 pi over 6 is going to also be root 3 over 3, but it has to be negative because it ends in quadrant 4. Well, 24 pi over 6 is not a good example because 24 over 6 simplifies. But if it was 27 pi over 6, that one simplifies too. If it was 25 pi over 6, that doesn't simplify. 25 pi over 6 is 4 and 1/6 pi, which ends in quadrant 1. And then tan of 25 pi over 6 would be positive root 3 over 3.
But in any case, like any number is a coefficient if it doesn't simplify, it would be...
It'll be root 3 over 3. Yeah. Just like any cos of pi over 4 is always root 2 over 2. Any cos of pi over 3 will be a half. You just have to figure out what quadrant it's in to figure out if it's positive a half or negative a half. And so now we know this is negative root 3 over 3. And so the last thing we need to do is use our skills of fractions and multiplying and radicals and negatives and put that together as a final answer. So a couple things here. Can you see that your final answer is going to be positive? It's going to be a fraction that's positive because you have two negatives multiplied together. That's going to make a positive. If you can see things that can simplify early, can you see that these 2's could simplify away? I suggest doing that right away. It makes life easier. What happens when you multiply root 2 by root 3? You get root 6. What happens when you multiply 1 times 3? You get 3. Can I simplify that anymore? No. You can't simplify the 6 and the 3 because the 6 is inside that square root. So there's our final answer, root 6 over 3. Solving trig equations with radians. We can now solve equations without our calculator. So in the past, if you would have got sine theta equals negative root 3 over 2, you would have been dealing in degrees. In the past, this is what you would have done. You would have said to yourself, negative root 3 over 2, well, according to my cast rule, that means that one angle is in quadrant 3. The other one would be in quadrant 4. So I'm going to just solve this like you would have done in grade 11. If you had sine theta equals negative root 3 over 2, and it said between 0 and 360 degrees, you would have been able to say it has to be in quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So you would know this is root 3 and this is 2. This is root 3 and this is 2. Here's your reference angle. And you would have taken out your calculator and done, my reference angle is sine inverse of root 3 over 2. And after you would have done that, your calculator would have said 60 degrees is your reference angle. So you would have said 180 plus 60 to get 240 degrees, and 360 minus 60 to get 300 degrees. That was last year. Okay? This year, you don't get this step with your calculator. Okay? So how do you do that if you don't have a calculator? It's all about recognition. So we have sine of theta is negative root 3 over 2. If it's a non-calculator question, that means that that value is probably on your pie plate. Do you ever have a y-coordinate with root 3 over 2? What family is that in? It's in the 60-degree family, but now we're dealing in radians, so we would say the pi over 3 family. So the fact that you recognize that root 3 over 2 is on your unit circle as a y-coordinate when the angle is part of the pi over 3 family, that tells you right away that your reference angle is pi over 3. Then to figure out what theta is, and the domain that's given here says between 0 and 2 pi, so that's 1 positive revolution around your circle. When is sine negative in 1 positive revolution around your circle? In quadrants 3 and 4, just like you would have known from before. So then you say, well, what are my pi over 3 family members in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4? In quadrant 3, I would have what pi over 3? 4 pi over 3. In quadrant 4, 5 pi over 3. And we're done. No calculator, just our unit circle. No reference angle calculated. We just have to recognize root 3 over 2 is on our unit circle. It's part of our pi over 3 family. Sine, according to the cast rule, is negative in quadrants 3 and quadrants 4. What are my pi over 3 family members in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4? 4 pi over 3 and 5 pi over 3. Right here, it has to be in quadrant 3 or 4 because we have a negative. And according to your cast rule, sine is positive in quadrant 1 and 2 and negative in quadrants 3 and 4. I got my final answers because it's root 3 over 2, which tells me it's my pi over 3 family. And if it's negative in quadrants here in quadrant 3 and here in quadrant 4, what are my pi over 3 angles in those two quadrants? Again, we're going to solve one time around in radians from 0 to 2 pi. We have cos equals to negative 1. Is your x-coordinate ever negative 1 on your unit circle? At 180. And since we're not dealing in degrees, we're dealing in radians, you'll just go theta equals pi. Done. So these questions get really quick. That's it. Nice. It's a lot shorter than having to, what would have happened last year? You would have done cos inverse of 1 to get your reference angle. Your reference angle would have been 0 degrees. It would have thrown you off, and you would have been a little bit scared. But cos is negative. Where is cos negative? Quadrant 2 and quadrant 3. So you might have even drawn a triangle in quadrant 2 and a triangle in quadrant 3, and then went, okay, this is 0 degrees. What angle is that? Okay, well, what's 180 minus 0? 180. Close. What's 180 plus 0? 180. And so the only answer is 180. But it's much easier to see if you think about your x-coordinate on your unit circle. When do you have -1? Yeah, that's at -1, 0. And that's at pi, or 180 degrees. Tan of theta equals -1. Is tan ever 1 on your unit circle? What family? Pi over 4. So we already know our reference angle is pi over 4. What quadrants is tan negative in? Quadrant 2 and quadrant 4. What's the pi over 4 family member in quadrant 2? 3 pi over 4. What's the pi over 4 family member in quadrant 4? 7 pi over 4. And we've solved it. So if the values are on your unit circle, solving these equations can be very quick, because you can immediately know your reference angle and immediately know your answers. No, not always going to be on the unit circle. We'll get some where are part way on the unit circle. So secant theta equals 2. Secant is not on your unit circle. So step 1, secant, what's the reciprocal of secant? Cos. So if secant theta is 2, then cos of theta will be 1 over 2. Is 1 over 2 ever your x-coordinate? Yes. What family? That's your pi over 3 family. What quadrants will it be in? 1 and 4. So pi over 3, what's your pi over 3 family member in quadrant 4? 5 pi over 3.